Although the United States makes up just about 5% of the world population, it accounts for up to 50% of the world's civilian-owned guns. Guns and gun violence have long been emotional issues in the U.S., but while gun owners and their advocates insist on their constitutional right to bear arms, President Obama is now forging ahead with gun sale reform efforts. We begin with this report from CCTV's John Gilmore.
At a crowded park in Chicago, 13 people shot.
Man, it was a lot of shots, man, like boom, 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 boom.
The youngest victim, a 3-year-old boy, shot in the face.
Military-type weapons, like the one we believe to have been used in this shooting, belong on a battlefield.
At a movie theater in Colorado, 12 people shot and killed. At a church in South Carolina, 9 African Americans shot dead while attending prayer.
Just want people to know that I'm going to miss her.
The shooter, a 21-year-old suspected white supremacist with a gun. And at a school in Connecticut, another shooting massacre.
There were 18 children that were pronounced dead at the school.
The memory of that 2012 tragedy bringing the President of the United States to tears.
Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad.
Now, President Obama is taking action to try and curb America's gun violence problem.
Because people are dying. And the constant excuses for inaction no longer do.
The number of gun-related deaths in the United States is staggering. According to Gun Violence Archive, a group that monitors gun-related violence, last year over 13,000 died as a result of gun violence in the U.S. Of those fatalities, almost 700 were children under the age of 11. And overall, about 27,000 people were injured. The number of firearms in the U.S. is now estimated to be over 350 million, more than one for every American. But President Obama has outlined a series of executive actions without the approval of Congress that he hopes will make it harder to purchase a gun. And he placed a major emphasis on background checks.
Anybody in the business of selling firearms must get a license and conduct background checks or be subject to criminal prosecutions.
Still, Obama is opposed by a powerful gun lobby, the National Rifle Association, that insists on an American's constitutional right to bear arms. And Republican presidential candidates have also denounced his action.
Well, I oppose gun violence, and I don't think anything the president's talking about doing or is doing will prevent it. Because gun violence is committed by criminals, and criminals don't care what the law is.
So, despite the modest measures announced by the president, his plan for more gun control is likely to face legal and political hurdles ahead. John Gilmore, CCTV, Washington.
Joining me now from New York is Leah Gunn Barrett. She is the Executive Director for New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. With me here in the studio is Richard Fowler. He is a radio talk show host and activist. Also with us from New York is attorney Deborah Blum. Welcome to all of you to the show. Leah, let me start with you. There's something like 350 million guns in the United States. That's more than the entire population of the country. And according to a report released last August, there is at least one mass shooting every day in the country. And they define a mass shooting as a shooting where there are 4 victims or more. President Obama is talking about taking executive action. He's talking about more stringent background checks. Is it going to help?
Well, it'll help at the margins, and he's already taken the action, by the way. It went into effect last Tuesday, and I was there in Washington when he made the announcement. One correction to the report that preceded this, there are actually nearly 34,000 gun deaths every year if you include suicides, which is also gun violence. Nearly 22,000 Americans take their lives using a gun, and 84,000 Americans are injured but do not die. And some of these injuries are life-threatening. So back to Obama's actions. Yes, I think what he's doing is enforcing the laws on the books, which is what the gun lobby and Republicans have said he needs to do. So I don't understand why they're squealing like stuck pigs, because all he's doing is clarifying the definition of what it means to be in the business of selling firearms. He's also proposing additional resources for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is the federal enforcement agency for our federal gun laws, which has been stripped of funding, seriously underfunded since 9/11. All other funding law enforcement agencies have received enhanced funding except for the ATF. And he's also calling for more funding for mental health care and services in the United States, which, again, the Republicans have said is the reason for gun violence. It's not the reason, clearly, but Obama is putting their feet to the fire on this one, saying this is what you've been asking for, so why don't you appropriate the money for this? The problem is that Congress has done nothing since Sandy Hook, which everyone thought was a watershed with the death of 26-year-olds and 6 educators. But you have to remember that every single day, 90 Americans are dying from guns in this country, 8 of whom are children on average. So this is truly a public health crisis. It's an epidemic. 1 person died from Ebola in the United States. 30,000 died from Ebola in Africa. And that was, the world was on tenterhooks about that. Every single year, 33,000 Americans are slaughtered with guns, and yet Congress does nothing.
Richard, one of the arguments being made by those who do not support any kind of change to the laws regarding gun ownership, and this was mentioned by the National Rifle Association, which is a pro-gun lobby here in the United States, a very powerful lobby, and it said, good guys with guns kill bad guys with guns.
That's the same argument you hear over and over and over from the NRA and the gun lobby. The crazy part about it is, Anand, if you think about the timeline from when the president said he was going to create some sort of gun action, right? He was going to do something on guns. Immediately, before they even read the executive order, the NRA and all their pals and buddies that they've paid for in Congress, including Ted Cruz, ran out and said, this is awful. No matter what the president does, it's going to be awful. And if you really think about it, right, and you look at all the polling data tells you, and most common sense Americans understand that if you are a good person with a gun, you don't want bad people with guns to get guns. And when you can, in a gun show in Arizona, when somebody can walk in and buy enough weapons to blow up ISIS, we have a serious problems on our hands. And I think that's what the president's really laser focused on fixing. Sadly, Congress won't join him in fixing it, but you would hope, and as the president's going to speak in just a couple hours throughout the State of the Union, you would hope that people in Congress would say, you know, thoughts and prayers aren't enough. We're actually going to have some action to prevent individuals from shooting other people. But you're probably not going to get that.
Right, Deborah, what we're hearing is that President Obama isn't on taking away guns from people. Is that what he's trying to do?
Absolutely not. The government has the power to regulate and control gun ownership. The Second Amendment absolutely provides the right for individuals in the United States to bear arms. The seminal case from 2008, D.C. versus Heller, struck down Washington, D.C.'s blanket ban on gun ownership and people in their home who were allowed to own guns having to have them disarmed. But that same Supreme Court case gave the government the right to have reasonable restrictions on gun ownership. The question is whether President Obama can make an executive order, and if that's going to be challenged, whether or not the legislature would have to be the one that imposes these restrictions. But the government does have the right to limit our access to guns, and we have a very big problem in this country with gun violence. So taking steps towards eradicating the wrong people from having guns is absolutely necessary. It's not limiting our constitutional freedoms.
Why is gun ownership enshrined in the Constitution in the first place, Deborah?
Well, it's in the Second Amendment, which provides the right to bear arms. It's a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So this gives us as citizens the right to have guns and the right to protect ourselves. And that's what our forefathers wanted for the citizens of the United States.
Right.
But they couldn't envision where we are now, which is why we need to have reform. The president isn't trying to take away the Second Amendment right. He's
Okay, Leah,
Go right
I mean, let's take a look at one example of how that particular amendment is being interpreted. Let's listen to what one of the president's opponents, this is a presidential candidate, Ted Cruz, here in the United States. This is what he had to say. Let's watch.
we've seen regimes across the face of the earth come and take away people's guns, strip away their rights to defend themselves, and sometimes it's been very popular. And yet, it is an inevitable prelude to tyranny.
So there we heard from Ted Cruz that an America without guns would become a tyranny.
Yeah, you know, Ted Cruz is full of it. You know, look, no one is trying to come and take away anybody's guns. All we're trying to do, all Obama is trying to do is hold up existing law that Congress passed to keep guns out of the hands of terrorists, violently, mentally ill people, convicted felons, domestic abusers, children, people who should not have firearms. And the Second Amendment, by the way, was actually always interpreted prior to Heller in 2008 as a collective militia right. The first part of the Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. And the NRA likes to conveniently forget that first clause. And it was only the Roberts Conservative Court in Scalia's opinion in 2008 in the Heller case, which reversed centuries of jurisprudence, saying that it was no longer a collective militia right, but an individual right to have a gun in your home for self-defense. Self-defense is not even mentioned in the Second Amendment.
Right.
It's not about that. And Ted Cruz, by the way, who can take anyone seriously who fries bacon on the end of an assault weapon after he's finished firing it? I mean, the guy is a joke.
Leah is absolutely right, and I think to take her argument a step further, think about when this Constitution was written, right? It was written in the 17th century. At that point in time, neither myself nor Leah, or probably you and I, could vote, right? 18-year-olds weren't allowed to vote. There was still slavery in this country. So when this was written, it was written in a time and place where the right to bear arms was necessary because you lived on a farm and there was nothing around you. You can't tell me today, if you look at any major city, Chicago, Miami, Washington, D.C., New York City, Boston, Detroit, that it is okay for people to have the right to bear arms when they're killing each other in the numbers that they're killing each other. And I think if you were to ask Benjamin Franklin, if you were to ask Thomas Jefferson today, they would tell you, if they saw today, they would probably not have that amendment in the Constitution.
Deborah, why is it...
Well, let me
Go ahead.
respond to that.
Go ahead.
I'd like to respond to that. I represent individuals who are charged with gun possession crimes, murder, various violent crimes, and those people don't have licensed weapons. And if we look at other countries, for example, France, they allow children to drink underage, what we consider to be underage, and they don't have the drinking problems that we have here. So we can make the argument that there are a lot of restrictions here on gun ownership, but people are still accessing them. And if we came up with a more workable solution, we might not have as many problems as we do. A lot of the issue also is mental health issues. People become very mentally ill and then they act out in a violent fashion, which is a lot of the cause of the
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt that.
I disagree there too, completely. And
well, I disagree
that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong.
Yeah, just 1 moment.
People who have mental illness are far more likely to be
that have
victims
these
than
issues?
perpetrators of gun violence.
Okay, Richard.
This is not a way to...
but even if
you're actually stigmatizing people with mental illness unfairly, and it's inaccurate.
But even if that's true, right? And you know, illegal people who have guns are the ones that are being tried are illegal.
It isn't true,
right? The argument that you have to ask yourself is, how did they get the gun? A lot of times, if you trace that gun back, that gun traces back to a straw purchaser, that gun traces back to a gun show. That means that somebody bought it responsibly and sold it irresponsibly. And we've got to do everything in our power to regulate the sale of these weapons to people who shouldn't have one, who shouldn't have it.
Deborah, I've got to take a break very quickly.
I agree
and
with
we also know that federally licensed
Deborah, very quickly.
gun dealers are supplying 1% of FFLs, licensed gun dealers in this country,
All right. Deborah,
are supplying 90% of the crime guns.
Go ahead, Deborah.
I would like to
So they
respond
need
to
to be
that, but
cracked down
I
upon.
can wait.
Loretta Lynch could take action against them.
Okay, go ahead, Deborah, finally.
Well, I represent people in court who have mental health issues, and I'm not trying to dignify them and their violent actions. I'm saying that we need to work on what's creating the problems here, and that's what the president is trying to do by allocating funds to mental health treatment.